Hey everyone, John Lorden here. Welcome to another episode of Itchy Mysteries, this one being recorded for March 29th, 2018. You know, on the channel, we've kind of gone back and forth a little bit about police, about can they do better, are they doing enough? We had Mike the Cop, another YouTuber, on the channel. We did a whole talk with him about that and his organization, Humanizing the Badge. Today, I want to review a film that I think fits in really nicely with Mike's vision of humanizing the badge. This film is called Fallen and was produced in 2017. I caught it on Netflix here in the US. And let's start with the IMDB synopsis on it. A humanizing look at line-of-duty police deaths across the country and how these losses affect those close to the fallen as well as the communities they serve. I think that really sums it up nicely. There's a lot of things that really work for me in this film. A couple things that didn't quite hit me, I think, the way that the filmmaker anticipated. But let's just go ahead and jump into it. First of all, it says it's narrated by Michael Chiklis. I guess you could say that. The narration kind of feels like bookends. He kind of talks a bit at the beginning. I really don't remember him in the middle of the film at all. And then at the end, his voice kind of comes back and pops back in. I find Michael Chiklis to be an interesting choice, mainly because I know him best for playing what I would consider a crooked cop on The Shield. Of course, I know he's also from the Fantastic Four. He played The Thing. I know back in the 80s, he was the Commish, which might be one of the best, more humanized versions of a cop that you could see on television. But I thought it was a strange choice. And I love Michael for his acting, but it's not like his voice is particularly compelling. So I don't know. I felt like it was a little odd. And like I said, he kind of just bookends the film. He's not really narrating throughout the whole thing. In terms of the cinematography, I have to say the very first shot really grabbed my attention. I almost thought it was a piece of art, and then I realized it was actually footage. It was just a very unique, really well captured shot. Unfortunately, that's about where it ends. There's not a bunch of great cinematography here. It's all adequate. You get a lot of interview segments, so it's really, are they setting up nice shots for those interview segments? And I think they do a good enough job with that. But there's just nothing particularly eye-catching about that except for the content as you roll forward. And one of the real strong points here is that content. There are a couple of segments in particular where they are showing body cam footage is probably the stuff that grabs me the most, of encounters with people that are getting violent with police officers. And especially when you're watching it from a body cam, all of a sudden you're seeing a person that looks, just like as far away from you as I am right now. And this guy pulls up a gun and he's pointing it right at the officer, and in some cases even firing. Very dramatic footage. I don't think this film is gory at all. I don't think anyone that is queasy is going to have any issues, but the violence in it, in those particular segments, which are rather short, is really heightened. And I think it is, that's probably one of the things that I admire most about this film, because it just brings home the reality of what these situations can be like, how quickly they can escalate. The narrative is basically getting you to understand that, look, these are people that are putting themselves on the line, but they're trying to get you to understand more than just that statement that we've heard time and time again. You're coming to understand that these are guys that are, in some cases, going into people's homes and not knowing what the layout of the house is or what to expect on the other side of the door. Going into the streets and alleyways into very similar situations. And this film just really helps to nail that point in a really effective and clear way. On top of that, of course, it's called The Fallen, and it is covering several instances of fallen officers that are very dramatic. Really, it's a tough watch. I know right now that in terms of the media, we have a lot of media that's aiming at police officers and pointing a finger. And of course, I think that there's a lot of a lot of cases where that is certainly just and necessary. And if we are looking for change, I think that that is one of the mechanisms that's going to help it happen. But I definitely watched this with the mindset of I want to see the counter argument to it. And I realized about halfway in that this was a bit of a one-sided approach to this conversation, but I'm completely fine with that. I'm totally fine with that because sometimes you need to hear the extremes of the conversation to understand where the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I believe that in the media, we're constantly hearing the extremes from the public outcry, but we don't always get a real good opportunity to hear it from the police's perspective, which is one of the reasons why I appreciate Mike the Cop so much and his work on YouTube. So this film just, it kind of fits all of that rather well. In particular for the first half. And I mean, you're seeing footage of these people that, you know, a lot of us consider that cops can be emotionally disconnected, or they've got this kind of machismo, or they're doing this because they want to just be an alpha male in some situation. This movie really kind of tries to break down some of those walls and boil it down to these are people too. These are humans too. I don't think I've seen any film where I've seen so many cops shed a tear, and that was really touching in a different way for me than I typically see on the films that I cover here. Where this film kind of went off the rails for me is halfway through. The director, his name is Tomek Marchese, becomes a character in his own narrative that to me feels like it's tacked on to the end of this film, and I don't necessarily know why. It's got a running time of about 117 minutes, if I recall correctly. It didn't, I don't know, it would have been an excellent 45-minute or 50-minute documentary, but going into his story about what happens with him really just kind of confused the focus of the piece for me. It's tough because you're going from these stories of, and it's called The Fallen, of officers that are killed in the line of duty. And then you get Thomas's story, and it feels like the drama is being amped up for his story because it's weird to say this, but because his is a story where he didn't die. He went into a terrible situation. There was a young man that was, I think, stabbing his grandparents or something like that. And this officer went in to intervene, and he got stabbed several times. It was a career-ending injury. It is a terrible story. But coming on the heels of hearing about 4 officers that were writing reports in a coffee shop and were pretty much executed because they were simply in public wearing their uniforms, the order of how these stories came out unfortunately didn't work for me. And it sucks because I think Thomas did such a great job. He's kind of a one-man show in this. He directed it. He wrote it. I believe he also did the editing. Yeah, he did all the editing on it also. And I think that might have been the downfall. I think if he would have just brought in someone else, another perspective, another set of eyes, maybe someone that understood, I know this is weird to talk about in a film like this, but understood 3-act structure and dramatic narrative, that they might have been able to help him kind of course correct this and keep it very clear about what this film is about. Because the way it goes, it feels like 2 separate pieces that were just kind of clubbed together, and it doesn't have to. I think with some editing, if they would have taken Thomas's occurrence and added that as narration to the beginning of the film, him, not Michael Chiklis, him saying, hey, look, I've been in a near miss situation where my life was almost ended. Here's what happened to me. But then you get into the heavier stories and the more dramatic stories, it would have worked for me. I hit this really strange thing by the end of this film where Thomas just didn't come across as likable because you've been hit with such heavy drama. And then all of a sudden to hear, yes, it's terrible. Yes, no one should be stabbed. No one should have their wife in an ambulance with them being rushed to the hospital wondering if her husband's going to live or not. But the outcome of that story doesn't match the outcomes of the other stories very well. It still could have been included. It's just the way that it was kind of clubbed on to the end really didn't work. I had almost like a knee-jerk reaction to the second half of this film where some of the things I was afraid of in terms of the perception of it being leaning too much into one bias too heavily seemed to come out only in Thomas's story about himself. And it is really, really tough. I say this all the time on the channel. It's really tough for people to cover their own story and to do it in a fair and unbiased way. Unfortunately, Thomas got caught up in this, and it kind of ruins the end of this film a little bit. But outside of that, the stories are important. The access that he has, because he is a police officer, to other officers, to chiefs, and the sensitivity that he's able to elicit from them, because essentially when they're talking to the camera, they're talking to someone they can trust. They're talking to another one of their brothers in blue. All of that works really well in this piece. There's also a lot of man on the street interviews, you know, where they're basically just asking citizens their opinions of police officers. Very, very interesting stuff to see those reactions. And then there's some statistics that even kick in. Really, really interesting stuff. There's a lot that works well in this piece. Like I said, the Michael Chiklis thing, I would have tossed it out the window. I think Thomas should have done the narration. They should have flipped the order of when his story comes out so that it's an intro into these types of cases, not the dramatic highlight of the piece, which unfortunately the third act traditionally is if you look at just standard 3-act structure. But it's the least interesting of those stories because the stakes aren't high enough. We know that he has survived. I know it's weird to talk about this in that way, but I am reviewing a film here, and I do look at it kind of through that lens as well. So ultimately, do I recommend it? Here's the thing. If you are someone that is interested in the extremes of the conversation around policing, yes, I do think that it is worth. I mean, just go into it knowing that this is produced, written, edited, directed by a police officer, and a police officer that had a very, very close call. So of course he's going to have a bias in this. Unfortunately, he's not very clear about that at the start of the film. You don't get that until the middle. And then, like I said, the drama is just broken at the end. But outside of that, very interesting facts, very interesting perspective. The footage of those close calls, I'm telling you, is probably worth it alone if you really want to get a sense of the type of danger that these officers can face in certain situations. So I do actually recommend it for you if you're in that mindset. If you're someone that is just opposed to that mindset, not willing to consider hearing the other side of the conversation, I understand that. I know that these are very trying times right now in terms of what we consider excessive force. I get that. So here's your fair warning. Don't put yourself through it if you're not ready to have some of those beliefs challenged. But for me, half the film, really, really strong. Unfortunately, another half of the film, not so strong, and it takes away from some of the focus of what makes this thing work so well. All that being said, it rates pretty good on IMDb. It's rating an 8 out of 10 right now. For me personally, because of how broken I felt, I hate saying it, but the second half just did not work at all for me. I got to knock it down to about a 6.5 for me personally. But like I said, I think there's a lot to appreciate about this. And if nothing else, I appreciate the effort. Almost in the same vein as Mike the Cop, you've got someone that's doing the job, trying to share their experience and to give those of us that don't have that experience insight into what it's really like. This film takes a really big swing at trying to do that, and it does pretty well. It does pretty well in certain places with changing perspective, maybe opening up your mind a little bit to the other side of that conversation, which is one of the things that I appreciate most about documentaries, is that they have the ability, the power, if they're kind of done right, to really do that, to really challenge our beliefs. So let's talk about it in the comments below. Have you seen this? Are you going to see it? Does it sound like something you'd be interested in, or something you'd probably pass based on what I said? Let me know about it in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Itchy Mysteries. Please come back to the Lord and Arts channel tomorrow. I'll have a new brain scratch for you then. See you there.